The sun hung low over the Nile, its golden light spilling across the water like molten fire. The air was thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and the distant hum of prayers rising from the temples. I stood at the edge of the sacred river, my bare feet sinking into the cool mud, and felt the weight of the day pressing down on me. My name is Neferre, and I am a priestess of Anubis. For generations, my family has served the god of the dead. We are the keepers of his secrets, the guardians of the rituals that guide souls to the afterlife. But lately, something has felt off. The gods have been restless. The omens are unclear. And in the temple archives where I spend most of my days, there is a strange energy, as if the very walls are whispering secrets meant only for me. It was there in the deepest chamber of the archives that I found the scroll. The chamber was dark, lit only by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. Dust hung in the air and the shelves were crammed with ancient texts, their papyrus edges brittle with age. I had been searching for a record of an old ritual, something to calm the growing unease among the temple priests, when my fingers brushed against a scroll hidden behind a row of crumbling jars. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran through me. The scroll was unlike any I had ever seen. Its papyrus was unnaturally smooth, and the ink seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The symbols etched across its surface were unfamiliar, yet somehow I could read them. They spoke of a ritual, a forbidden ritual that would allow Anubis to walk among the living and judge their hearts before death. My heart raced as I read. The ritual required the blood of a priestess, a prayer spoken in the tongue of the gods, and a sacrifice of pure intent. It was dangerous, reckless even, but something about it called to me. I felt a pull, as if Anubis himself were guiding my hand. That night, under the light of a full moon, I performed the ritual. The temple courtyard was silent, the air heavy with the scent of incense. I knelt before the altar, my hands trembling, as I pricked my finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the scroll. The symbols glowed faintly and I began to chant the words I had memorized. The language was ancient, guttural, and it felt strange on my tongue. But as I spoke, the air around me seemed to shift, growing colder, denser. When I finished, there was a moment of perfect stillness. Then, a shadow moved at the edge of the courtyard. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stepped into the moonlight and I saw him, Anubis. He was taller than I had imagined, his jackal-headed form both terrifying and majestic. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his presence filled the courtyard, pressing down on me like a physical weight. For a moment he simply stared at me, his gaze piercing as if he could see into the very depths of my soul. Then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You have called me, priestess," he said. "But do you understand what you have done?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. The truth was, I didn't understand. I had acted on instinct, driven by a force I couldn't name. Now standing before the god of the dead, I felt small and foolish. Anubis stepped closer, his movements graceful and deliberate. "The balance of life and death is delicate," he said. "By calling me into the world of the living, you have disrupted that balance. The consequences will be severe." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I only wanted to help," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "The people are afraid. They need guidance." Anubis tilted his head, studying me. "Guidance," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Perhaps, but the living are not meant to be judged before their time. Their hearts are ever-changing, their paths uncertain. To judge them now would be complicated." Before I could respond, a sound broke the silence. Low guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I turned to see shadows moving at the edge of the courtyard, shapes that seemed to writhe and twist in the darkness. Anubis's eyes narrowed. "The dead are restless," he said. "My presence here has disturbed them. They will not stay in the duat for long." My heart pounded as the shadows drew closer. I could see them now. Figures with hollow eyes and grasping hands, their forms flickering like smoke. They were the dead, drawn to the world of the living by Anubis's presence. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Anubis turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We restore the balance," he said, "but it will not be easy. The other gods will not take kindly to my interference, and the mortals will fear what they do not understand. Are you prepared for what lies ahead, priestess?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I knew one thing. I couldn't turn back now. "I am," I said, though my voice wavered. Anubis nodded, his gaze steady. "Then we begin." As the dead closed in around us, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever was coming, I would face it. For the first time in my life, I felt a connection to something greater than myself. A purpose that went beyond the walls of the temple. But as the shadows swallowed the courtyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had unleashed something far beyond my control. And I was right. The dead surrounded us, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Their forms were insubstantial, like smoke given shape, but their presence was undeniable. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear the faint whispers that seemed to echo from a place far beyond the mortal world. Anubis stood beside me, his jackal-headed silhouette towering and imposing. He raised a hand, and the dead hesitated, their movements faltering as if caught in an invisible current. "Stay close, priestess," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "The dead are drawn to the living, especially now that the balance has been disturbed. They will not harm you unless you give them reason." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. The courtyard felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in from all sides. I clutched the scroll tightly, its smooth surface a strange comfort against my trembling fingers. "We must leave this place," Anubis continued. "The longer I remain in the world of the living, the more the dead will rise. We must find a way to restore the balance before it is too late." "Where do we go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Anubis turned to me, his glowing eyes piercing. "To the heart of the chaos," he said. "To the mortals who will be judged." Before I could respond, he began to walk, his movements fluid and deliberate. The dead parted before him, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. I followed, my steps hesitant but determined. The temple gates loomed ahead, their heavy, wooden doors creaking open as if moved by an unseen hand. Beyond the gates, the city was eerily silent. The streets, usually bustling with life even at night, were empty. The only sound was the distant howl of the wind, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. As we walked, Anubis began to speak. "The living are not meant to be judged before their time," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Their hearts are ever-changing, their paths uncertain. To judge them now is to risk disrupting the natural order of things. But the ritual you performed has bound me to this task, and I cannot turn away." I swallowed hard, guilt twisting in my chest. "I didn't mean to cause harm," I said. "I only wanted to help." Anubis glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Intentions matter little in the face of consequences, priestess. What is done cannot be undone. Now we must face what comes." We reached the edge of the city, where the houses gave way to open fields and the dark silhouette of the desert beyond. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of a village, its lights flickering like stars against the night. Anubis stopped, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There," he said, "the first judgment awaits." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What will you do?" "I will weigh their hearts," he replied. "As I have done for the dead, so too shall I do for the living. But the consequences will be different." Before I could ask what he meant, he began to walk again, his steps carrying him toward the village. I followed, my mind racing with questions and fears. The village was small, its houses clustered around a central square. The people were gathered there, their faces pale and frightened in the moonlight. They had seen Anubis approaching, and now they stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. Anubis stepped into the square, his presence commanding silence. The people fell to their knees, their heads bowed in reverence and fear. "Rise," he said, his voice echoing through the night. I am not here to harm you. I am here to judge. A murmur ran through the crowd, but no one dared to speak. Anubis raised a hand, and a set of golden scales appeared before him, hovering in the air as if held by an invisible force. Step forward, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Let your heart be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. For a moment, no one moved. Then a young man stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He was a farmer, his hands calloused from years of labor, his eyes filled with a quiet strength. Anubis nodded, and the man approached the scales. What is your name? Anubis asked. Khepri, the man replied, his voice steady. Khepri, Anubis repeated. Do you swear to speak the truth, to let your heart be judged without deceit? I do, Khepri said. Anubis placed a hand on the man's chest, and a faint glow emanated from his fingertips. Slowly, a shimmering image of a heart appeared, hovering above the scales. Anubis placed it on one side, and a single feather, white and pure, appeared on the other. The scales trembled, then began to tip. I held my breath as the heart and the feather balanced perfectly, the scales hovering in perfect equilibrium. Anubis nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Your heart is true, Khepri. You have lived with integrity and honor. You may go in peace. The man bowed deeply, his relief palpable, and stepped back into the crowd. But not all were so fortunate. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, their hearts weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Some were found worthy, their hearts light and pure. Others were not. A woman who had stolen from her neighbors, a man who had lied to protect himself, a child who had harbored hatred in his heart. For each, Anubis delivered his judgment with calm, authority. Those found unworthy were marked, their souls bound to him until the balance could be restored. As the night wore on, I watched in silence, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had unleashed. The people's fear was palpable, their whispers filled with dread. And then it happened. A man stepped forward, his eyes filled with defiance. He was a merchant, his clothes fine, but his expression hard. I have done nothing wrong, he said. His voice sharp. I will not be judged by you. Anubis regarded him calmly. All must be judged, he said. Step forward or I will take your heart by force. The man hesitated, then spat on the ground. I will not. Anubis's eyes glowed brighter, and he raised a hand. The man's heart was ripped from his chest, glowing, faintly as it hovered above the scales. The scales tipped sharply, the heart far heavier than the feather. Anubis's expression darkened. You have lived a life of greed and deceit, he said. Your heart is unworthy. The man screamed as his soul was bound to Anubis, his form flickering like the others who had been judged. The crowd erupted in panic, their fear turning to anger. This is your doing, someone shouted, pointing at me. You brought this upon us. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I didn't mean to, but the crowd was already turning on me, their faces twisted with rage. Anubis raised a hand, and a wave of silence swept over the square. Enough, he said, his voice like thunder. The priestess is under my protection. Harm her and you will face my judgment. The crowd fell silent, their anger subdued but not extinguished. Anubis turned to me, his expression unreadable. Come, he said, we have much to do. As we left the village, the weight of what I had done settled heavily on my shoulders. The dead followed us, their whispers growing louder with each step. And in the distance, the first light of dawn began to break, casting long shadows across the land. The sun rose slowly over the desert, its light casting long shadows across the sand. The dead followed us, their forms flickering like flames in the wind, their whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind. Anubis walked ahead, his silhouette stark against the dawn, his presence both comforting and unnerving. We had left the village behind, but the weight of what had happened there lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. The people's fear, Their anger, it clung to me, a reminder of the chaos I had unleashed. As we walked, Anubis spoke, his voice low and measured. "The living are not meant to bear the weight of judgment before their time," he said. "Their hearts are ever-changing, their paths uncertain. To judge them now is to risk disrupting the natural order of things." I nodded, though his words did little to ease my guilt. "But the ritual, it bound you to this task. Can it be undone?" Anubis glanced at me, his glowing eyes piercing. "The ritual is but a thread in the tapestry of fate," he said. "To undo it would require unraveling the very fabric of existence. No, priestess, we must see this through to its end." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What happens if we fail? Anubis did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "If we fail," he said finally, "the balance of life and death will be shattered. The dead will rise, the living will fall, and the gods themselves will be consumed by chaos." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I knew there was no turning back. We continued our journey, the desert stretching endlessly before us. The dead followed, their whispers growing louder with each step. I could feel their presence pressing in on me, a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we reached the edge of a vast oasis. The water shimmered in the light, its surface smooth and unbroken. But as we approached, I noticed something strange. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Anubis stopped at the edge of the oasis, his gaze fixed on the water. "This place is not what it seems," he said. "Be on your guard." I nodded, my heart pounding. The oasis was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, something that set my nerves on edge. We stepped into the water, the coolness a welcome relief from the heat of the desert. But as we waded deeper, the shadows around us began to shift, their forms taking on a more sinister shape. Suddenly, the water around us began to churn, and a figure emerged from the depths. It was a woman, her form ethereal and otherworldly. Her hair flowed like water, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. She was beautiful, but there was something cold and calculating in her gaze. "Anubis," she said, her voice like the whisper of waves. "What brings you to my domain?" Anubis regarded her calmly. "Taweret," he said. "We seek passage through your waters. We have no quarrel with you." The woman, Taweret, smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You bring chaos to my waters, Anubis. The dead follow you, and the living fear you. Why should I grant you passage?" Anubis's eyes glowed brighter, and he stepped forward. "Because the balance of life and death depends on it," he said. "If we fail, your waters will run dry, and your domain will be consumed by chaos." Tawaret's smile faded, and she regarded him with a calculating gaze. "Very well," she said finally. "I will grant you passage. But know this, if you fail, the consequences will be dire." With that, she disappeared beneath the water, the surface smoothing once more. We continued through the oasis, the tension in the air growing thicker with each step. The dead followed, their whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind. As we reached the other side, Anubis stopped and turned to me. "We must prepare," he said. "The other gods will not take kindly to our actions. They will see us as a threat to the natural order." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "What do we do?" Anubis's gaze was steady. "We must find the source of the imbalance," he said. "The scroll you used, it was not of this world. It was planted by someone who seeks to disrupt the balance of life and death." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Set," I said, the name slipping from my lips before I could stop it. Anubis nodded. "Set, the god of chaos. He seeks to overthrow the divine order and claim power for himself. The scroll was his doing, and he will stop at nothing to see his plan through." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do we do? Anubis's eyes glowed brighter and he stepped closer. We must confront him, he said. But we cannot do it alone. We will need the help of the other gods. I felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by fear. Will they help us? Anubis's expression was unreadable. They may not have a choice. With that, he turned and began to walk, his steps carrying him toward the horizon. I followed, my mind racing with questions and fears. The dead followed us, their whispers growing louder with each step, and in the distance the first signs of a gathering storm began to appear, the clouds dark and foreboding. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. But I knew there was no turning back. The balance of life and death depended on us, and I would not let it fall. The storm clouds gathered overhead, dark and foreboding, as Anubis and I approached the edge of the desert. The dead followed us, their whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind, their forms flickering like shadows in the dim light. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of the gods' gaze upon us. Anubis walked ahead, his silhouette stark against the stormy sky. His presence was both comforting and unnerving, a reminder of the power he wielded and the stakes we faced. We are close, he said, his voice low and measured. The source of the imbalance lies ahead. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but now as we approached the heart of the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. We reached the edge of a vast canyon, its depths shrouded in shadow. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the ground beneath our feet trembled with the force of the storm. Anubis stopped at the edge of the canyon, his gaze fixed on the darkness below. Set is here, he said. He has been waiting for us. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do we do? Anubis turned to me, his glowing eyes piercing. We confront him, he said, but we must be careful. Set is cunning, and he will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. With that, he stepped forward, his movements fluid and deliberate. I followed, my steps hesitant but determined. The dead followed us, their whispers growing louder with each step. As we descended into the canyon, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, and the walls of the canyon loomed overhead, their surfaces slick with moisture. At the bottom of the canyon, we found Set. He stood in the center of a vast chamber, his form towering and imposing. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his presence filled the chamber, pressing down on us like a physical weight. Anubis, he said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. You have come at last. Anubis regarded him calmly. Set, he said. Your actions have disrupted the balance of life and death. It is time to end this. Set smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You think you can stop me? He said. You are but a servant of the gods, bound by their laws. I am chaos incarnate, and I will not be bound. Anubis's eyes glowed brighter, and he stepped forward. You are wrong, he said. The balance of life and death is not yours to control. It is time to restore order. With that, he raised a hand, and a set of golden scales appeared before him, hovering in the air as if held by an invisible force. Set's smile faded, and he regarded the scales with a calculating gaze. You think you can judge me? He said. I am beyond your judgment. Anubis's expression was unreadable. We shall see, he said. He placed a hand on Set's chest, and a faint glow emanated from his fingertips. Slowly, a shimmering image of a heart appeared hovering above the scales. Anubis placed it on one side, and a single feather, white and pure, appeared on the other. The scales trembled, then began to tip. I held my breath as the heart and the feather balanced perfectly, the scales hovering in perfect equilibrium. Anubis nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Your heart is true, Set, he said. You have lived with integrity and honor. You may go in peace. Set's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then he laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber. "You think you can judge me?" he said. "I am chaos incarnate, and I will not be bound by your laws." With that, he raised a hand, and a wave of darkness swept through the chamber, engulfing the scales and Anubis in its embrace. I stepped, back, my heart pounding. The dead followed me, their whispers growing louder with each step. Anubis emerged from the darkness, his form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. "Set," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You cannot escape judgment." Set's eyes glowed, brighter, and he raised a hand. "I am chaos incarnate," he said, "and I will not be bound." With that, he disappeared into the darkness, his form dissolving like smoke in the wind. Anubis turned to me, his expression unreadable. "It is done," he said. "The balance has been restored." I nodded, though my heart was heavy with the weight of what had happened. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but now, as we stood in the heart of the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. The dead followed us, their whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind. As we ascended from the canyon, the storm, clouds began to dissipate and the first light of dawn broke through the darkness. Anubis stopped at the edge of the canyon, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is time for me to return to the underworld," he said. "The balance has been restored, but the consequences of our actions will linger." I nodded, though my heart was heavy with the weight of what had happened. "What happens now?" Anubis turned to me, his glowing eyes piercing. "Now, we must live with the consequences of our actions," he said. "But know this, you have done well, priestess. The balance of life and death depends on those who are willing to fight for it." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, his form dissolving like smoke in the wind. I stood at the edge of the canyon, the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. The dead followed me, their whispers a constant hum in the back of my mind. As I walked back to the temple, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. The balance of life and death depended on us, and I would not let it fall.